Welcome, friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, unwinding after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet companion, you found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from. Perhaps you're wrapped in a blanket, sitting by a softly lit window, or resting somewhere under an open sky. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, comfortable, and ready to wander with me into the deep memory of our oceans, where the question of Atlantis dissolves into something far more mysterious than myth. If you find peace or curiosity in these gentle stories, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a moment of stillness too. And to those who've already joined along, thank you. 3 miles beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, in trenches so deep that sunlight has never touched their floors, sediment accumulates grain by grain in perfect silence. Each microscopic particle carries within it the chemical signature of the world above the salt content of ancient seas, the pollen of forests that bloomed and died, the volcanic ash from eruptions that darkened skies for years. Here, in layers so thin they measure in millimeters, lies a record more complete than any human archive, more faithful than any memory carved in stone. The seafloor receives everything with infinite patience. Dust from the Sahara drifts down through 2 miles of black water, settling alongside the calcium shells of plankton that lived and died in surface waters warmed by a sun that shone on civilizations now forgotten. Fragments of meteors that crossed space for millions of years find their final rest here, mixed with clay washed from mountains that no longer exist. The deep ocean remembers what the land forgets: the exact temperature of seas that lapped against shores where no footprint remains. The chemistry of air breathed by people whose names were never written down, whose languages dissolved into silence centuries before the first alphabet was conceived. In the eastern Mediterranean, where legend places Atlantis somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, core samples reveal something remarkable. The sediment speaks of times when this sea was not a sea at all, but a landscape of salt flats and bitter lakes, a desert basin deeper than the Grand Canyon. Wind howled across crystalline plains where now fish swim in eternal darkness. The limestone that forms the bedrock of Greek islands still bears the microscopic fossils of creatures that swam in tropical seas, back when these mountains lay beneath warm, shallow waters near the equator, before continents drifted to their present positions with geological slowness that makes human history seem like a single heartbeat. Scientists drill into this ancient memory with hollow tubes that penetrate centuries with each meter. They extract cylinders of compressed time, where each layer represents decades or centuries of patient accumulation. The drilling platforms float on surface waters blue as lapis lazuli, their lights reflecting in gentle swells, while far below their instruments, probe deposits laid down when ice sheets covered half of Europe and mammoths walked where London now stands. Under microscopes, they read the story written in diatoms, tiny glass-walled algae whose delicate forms record the salinity, temperature, and chemistry of waters that existed long before human memory began, long before the first proto-language distinguished between sea and sky. The mystery embedded in these cores runs deeper than any question of Atlantis. How many times has this sea vanished and returned? How many landscapes have been drowned, preserved in salt, and drowned again? The sediment holds secrets that make Plato's sunken city seem like yesterday's news, evidence of transformation so vast they dwarf any human catastrophe. Layers tell of epochs when the Mediterranean basin lay empty, a rift valley deeper than the Dead Sea. Its floor, covered in salt, deposits thousands of feet thick. Only the patient accumulation of geological evidence reveals this incredible truth: that one of Earth's greatest seas has died and been reborn more than once. The drilling cores bring up samples of these ancient salt beds, crystalline formations that grew in the supersaturated brine of dying seas. Halite crystals the size of dinner plates preserve tiny bubbles of that primordial water, samples of an ocean that existed before human ancestors descended from trees. When geologists crack open these salt crystals in laboratory clean rooms, they sometimes discover microscopic organisms still alive after millions of years of crystalline suspended animation bacteria that witnessed the birth and death of seas, now awakening under artificial lights to find their world transformed beyond recognition. Yet, even as these layers accumulate in darkness, they preserve moments of brightness. Volcanic glass from eruptions that lit the ancient sky spreads in bands across the seafloor, marking exact moments in deep time. The Santorini eruption that may have inspired Atlantis legends appears as a distinct layer of pumice and ash, its chemical fingerprint unmistakable even after 35 centuries of burial. Somewhere in these compressed millennia lie the chemical traces of every civilization that ever looked out across these waters, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. Bronze Age smelters left their signature in lead isotopes. Roman silver mines contributed their particular chemistry to Mediterranean sediments. Medieval warming periods and Little Ice Ages appear as shifts in the abundance of cold water versus warm water foraminifera. The ocean remembers them all, and remembers, too, the countless eons when no eyes existed to see the light dancing on its surface. In the deepest cores, below layers that record human presence, lie deposits from when the Mediterranean was young, when it first connected to the Atlantic through a narrow strait. Below that, sediments from when this sea was part of the ancient Tethys Ocean, which stretched from what is now the Atlantic to the Pacific before the collision of Africa and Europe began to squeeze it out of existence. Each layer a library, each grain a word in an epic written in the language of chemistry and time. The Mediterranean's deepest secrets rest in abyssal plains where the pressure would crush a human body instantly, where the temperature hovers just above freezing despite the warm surface waters miles above. Here, in perpetual midnight, the sediment continues its patient accumulation. Grain by grain, season by season, the seafloor rises imperceptibly, entombing whatever traces of our civilization will survive the next million years. Perhaps future archaeologists, if such beings exist, will drill through our compressed remains and wonder at the brief chemical anomaly we represent, the thin layer, marking the moment when one species temporarily altered the chemistry of atmosphere and ocean before disappearing back into the geological silence from which it emerged. The Mediterranean holds within its deepest basins a secret so profound that when scientists first discovered it, they questioned their own instruments. Between 5.96 and 5.33 million years ago, this sea that now cradles the ruins of ancient civilizations was not a sea at all, but a hellish landscape of salt deserts stretching below sea level for hundreds of miles. The Messinian salinity crisis, as geologists now call this chapter of deep time, transformed one of Earth's great water bodies into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. During this epoch, tectonic movements had gradually sealed the Mediterranean's connection to the Atlantic Ocean. The Strait at Gibraltar, that narrow passage between continents, closed like a geological valve, with its lifeline to the open ocean severed, the Mediterranean began to die. Under the relentless heat of the Miocene sun, water evaporated faster than rivers could replace it. The great sea shrank, concentrating its dissolved salts until even the hardiest marine life could no longer survive in its increasingly toxic brine. As water levels dropped, vast expanses of seafloor emerged into air that had not touched them for millions of years. Salt-encrusted mudflats stretched to horizons where no horizon should exist. In the deepest basins, where Rome and Athens would one day rise along distant shores, salt lakes glowed with unearthly colors, pink from halophilic bacteria that thrived in saturations poisonous to all other life. White, where gypsum crystals grew in geometric perfection across mineral plains that no animal would walk for another million years. The evaporate deposits that formed during this period now lie buried beneath thousands of feet of later sediment, but drilling reveals their extraordinary thickness. In some places, the salt beds measure over a mile deep, a testament to the cycles of drying and flooding that repeated across hundreds of thousands of years. These are not simple salt flats like those found in desert basins today, but layered monuments to geological patience, where each stratum records a different phase of the Mediterranean's slow strangulation and brief resurrections. Within these salt deposits, scientists discover the preserved remains of strange ecosystems that flourished in the dying sea's final refugia. Deep brine pools harbored communities of organisms adapted to salinities that would kill ordinary marine life in minutes. Microscopic foraminifera developed shells thick enough to withstand the crushing osmotic pressure of water saltier than the Dead Sea. These tiny survivors left their calcium carbonate tests in sediment layers that now serve as precise chronometers, marking the exact pace of the sea's decline and the equally exact timing of its eventual rebirth. The Messinian landscape would have resembled nothing in the modern world. Where the Balearic Islands now rise from azure waters, rocky peaks jutted from salt plains under skies hazed with mineral dust. The future sites of Venice and Alexandria lay thousands of feet below global sea level, their bedrock scoured by winds carrying crystals of gypsum and halite. Rivers that once flowed gently into coastal bays now plunged over limestone cliffs in waterfalls taller than Niagara, carving gorges through exposed seafloor as they sought the shrinking remnants of the ancient sea. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, large mammals migrated across the dry Mediterranean basin. Hippos and elephants, ancestors of species that would later populate Mediterranean islands, walked across salt flats where submarines now navigate, their fossilized footprints, preserved in clay layers between salt beds, mark pathways across a landscape that existed for less than a geological moment a few 100,000 years in Earth's 4.6 billion-year history, yet long enough for entire ecosystems to evolve, flourish, and vanish. The climate during the Messinian crisis was unlike anything the Mediterranean has experienced since. Without the moderating influence of a large water body, temperatures swung between extremes. Summer heat in the deep basins may have exceeded anything recorded on Earth's surface today, while winters brought freezing temperatures to latitudes where palm trees now grow. Dust storms, laden with salt crystals, swept across continents, carrying the chemical signature of the dying sea as far north as the Arctic Ocean and as far south as equatorial Africa. Yet even as the Mediterranean withered, life found ways to persist in the most unlikely refugia. Freshwater springs that emerged from underground aquifers created oases in the salt desert, supporting pockets of vegetation that served as stepping stones for migrating fauna. These spring-fed ecosystems left their own distinctive sedimentary signatures, layers of freshwater limestone and travertine that interrupt the monotonous salt deposits with brief intervals of biological complexity. The mystery that haunts this ancient catastrophe is how completely it erased itself. When the Mediterranean finally reconnected to the Atlantic, the returning waters buried all evidence of the salt desert beneath layers of normal marine sediment. Cities now thrive above landscapes that once resembled the most desolate corners of Mars. Fishermen cast nets over abyssal plains where camels might have walked, where the bones of terrestrial mammals lie entombed beneath salt beds that will dissolve away grain by grain over the next million years, leaving only the faintest chemical traces of an epoch when one of Earth's great seas simply ceased to exist. In the sediment cores that preserve this history, the Messinian salt appears as stark white bands interrupting the normal gray-brown sequence of marine deposits. Geologists call these layers the White Death, not for any biological catastrophe, but for the sterile beauty of their mineral perfection, laid down in absolute silence across a landscape waiting patiently for the return of waves that would not come for hundreds of millennia. The silence of the dried Mediterranean basin was broken by a sound no human ear would ever hear, the thunderous roar of the Atlantic Ocean pouring through a breach in the Gibraltar Gateway like the collapse of a liquid mountain. The Zanclean megaflood, named for the geological age it initiated, represents one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's recent history. What took hundreds of thousands of years to dry was undone in perhaps mere decades, as seawater cascaded into the empty basin with a force that dwarfs any waterfall in the modern world. The precise mechanism that reopened Gibraltar remains one of geology's elegant mysteries. Tectonic forces that had slowly squeezed the strait closed now shifted with imperceptible patience, allowing Atlantic waters to find the smallest crack in the barrier between Africa and Europe. At first, perhaps only a trickle seeped through water that evaporated before it could travel far into the salt desert, but erosion works with the relentlessness of time itself, and each drop that passed through the breach widened the channel by microscopic degrees. When the breakthrough finally came, it transformed the Mediterranean basin into the largest waterfall system Earth has ever known. Water plunged over limestone cliffs higher than modern skyscrapers, filling valleys that had been dry for millennia with a sound like continuous thunder. The Gibraltar Falls, as geologists now call this vanished cataract, may have been 100 times larger than Niagara, carrying more water in a single day than the Amazon River transports in a year. The spray from these falls would have created its own weather system, with clouds and rain patterns extending hundreds of miles into the basin. Sediment cores from the deepest parts of the Mediterranean preserve evidence of this catastrophic refilling in layers of turbidites, chaotic deposits formed when underwater landslides, triggered by the sudden weight of returning water, swept across the newly submerged sea floor. These sediment flows entombed entire landscapes in geological moments, preserving the salt desert's final configuration like amber preserves insects, buried river channels, wind-carved rock formations, and salt crystal gardens lie frozen in time beneath layers of Mediterranean mud. The physics of the refilling process defy easy comprehension. As water levels rose, the pressure at the Gibraltar Gateway increased exponentially, accelerating the flow until the Mediterranean began to fill at a rate measured in feet per day rather than inches per year. Computer models suggest that the deepest basins where cities like Naples and Palermo now overlook gentle harbors were inundated in less than a century. The incoming water-carved submarine canyons through the salt beds, dissolving deposits that had taken hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate, redistributing their chemical legacy throughout the reviving sea. Marine life returned to the Mediterranean in waves of colonization that paralleled the physical flood. Atlantic species poured through the Gibraltar Strait in one of evolution's greatest migrations, establishing populations in a sea that had been lifeless longer than most species exist. The first organisms to arrive were the hardiest bacterial communities that could survive in waters still tinged with dissolved salt from the underlying deposits. Behind them came the microscopic zooplankton, then larger invertebrates, and finally, fish, establishing food webs in an ocean younger than many individual trees. The coastlines that emerged from this transformation bore no resemblance to those that had bordered the ancient sea. The weight of the returning water triggered massive landslides as steep valley walls, carved by rivers during the dry period, collapsed under hydrostatic pressure. Islands that had been mountain peaks jutting from salt plains suddenly found themselves surrounded by deep water once again. The geography that would host classical civilizations was literally born from this collision between emptiness and abundance. Archaeological mysteries may be hidden in the story of the Zanclean flood. If early human ancestors witnessed any portion of this refilling, and the timeline suggests they might have observed its final phases, the catastrophe could have left traces in the deepest layers of cultural memory. The speed of the transformation would have made escape impossible for any creatures caught in the flooding valleys. Entire ecosystems that had adapted to the salt desert environment vanished beneath waves that advanced with the implacability of geological time compressed into human decades. The chemical signature of the flood remains readable in Mediterranean seawater today. Isotope ratios of oxygen and strontium still reflect the massive input of Atlantic water that diluted and transformed the basin's chemistry. Deep currents continue to circulate patterns established when the first Atlantic waters reached the deepest trenches, carrying with them the dissolved minerals of evaporate beds that once covered seafloor, now buried beneath 3 miles of water. Modern oceanographers studying the Mediterranean's circulation patterns observe currents that follow routes carved by the initial floodwaters. The Zanclean deluge established flow patterns that persist across millions of years, as if the sea remembers the violence of its own rebirth. Water masses move along paths determined by seafloor topography sculpted in the first decades of refilling, when the force of the incoming flood carved channels and deposited sediment according to the simple physics of moving water seeking its level. In the deepest cores, where sediment preserves the exact moment of transition from salt desert to living sea, geologists find a boundary sharp as a knife edge. Below the line, sterile white evaporates deposited in the poisonous brine of a dying ocean. Above it, gray mud rich with the fossils of creatures that had waited millions of years in Atlantic waters for their chance to colonize a newborn sea. The contact between these layers marks not just a change in rock type, but one of the most sudden environmental transformations preserved in Earth's geological record, the moment when emptiness became abundance, when silence gave way to the patient whisper of waves that would lap these shores for millions of years to come. On the volcanic island of Santorini, where whitewashed buildings now perch on cliffs overlooking the azure Aegean, archaeologists brush dust from frescoes that have not seen sunlight for 35 centuries. These paintings, dolphins leaping through stylized waves, priestesses bearing sacred offerings, young men boxing in ritual combat were buried instantly when one of history's most powerful volcanic eruptions entombed the Bronze Age city of Akrotiri beneath layers of pumice and ash. The Minoan civilization that created these masterpieces vanished so completely that their very existence was forgotten until modern excavations revealed their sophisticated culture sleeping beneath the volcanic debris. The Theran eruption, as geologists call the cataclysm that destroyed ancient Thera around 1600 BCE, released energy equivalent to hundreds of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. The explosion was heard across the ancient world. Egyptian records may preserve accounts of mysterious booming sounds from the north, while Chinese chronicles describe unusual atmospheric phenomena that could reflect ash clouds circling the globe. Yet for all its violence, this eruption represents merely a geological moment, one brief punctuation in the Mediterranean's patient accumulation of sedimentary memory. In the moments before the eruption, Akrotiri hummed with the daily activities of a Bronze Age port city. Potters shaped clay vessels in workshops filled with the scent of olive oil and wine. Merchants calculated profits from trade in purple dye extracted from murex shells. Children played in narrow streets while their mothers ground barley in stone querns, unchanged since the Neolithic. The frescoes preserve this world in exquisite detail, rooms decorated with lilies and monkeys, ships with high prows sailing seas dotted with dolphins, landscapes that blend realistic observation with religious symbolism in ways that still puzzle archaeologists. The Minoans who inhabited Akrotiri possessed technologies that would not be rediscovered for centuries after their disappearance. They engineered sophisticated plumbing systems with clay pipes that carried fresh water and removed waste with efficiency that rivaled Roman engineering. Their architects designed multi-story buildings with light wells and earthquake-resistant foundations, crucial innovations on an island that regularly trembled with volcanic activity. Storage rooms contained enormous ceramic jars called pithoi, some tall enough to hide a person, filled with grain, oil, and wine that sustained trade networks spanning the eastern Mediterranean. Marine archaeologists working in the waters around Santorini have discovered evidence that the Minoan influence extended far beyond their island homeland. Shipwrecks carrying Minoan pottery rest on seafloor that once lay closer to the surface, before post-eruption subsidence and rising sea levels buried Bronze Age coastlines beneath meters of water and sediment. These underwater sites preserve organic materials, rope, wood, and textiles that rarely survive in terrestrial archaeological contexts, offering glimpses of daily life that written records cannot provide. The mystery surrounding the Theran eruption extends beyond its immediate archaeological impact to its possible role in shaping later mythological traditions. When Plato described Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, he claimed Egyptian priests had preserved memories of a great island civilization destroyed by earthquakes and floods 9,000 years before his own time. While Plato's chronology places his fictional Atlantis far earlier than any known Mediterranean civilization, many scholars suggest that garbled memories of the Theran eruption and Minoan collapse may have inspired elements of his allegory. The volcanic deposits that buried Akrotiri preserve details of the eruption sequence with scientific precision. The lowest layers consist of fine pumice that fell like snow, accumulating slowly enough that residents had time to flee. No human remains have been found in the buried city. Above this lies coarser material ejected in more violent phases, when the eruption column collapsed and pyroclastic flows raced across land and sea at speeds exceeding hurricane winds. The final layers contain ash that settled from atmospheric clouds that may have circled the planet, contributing to climate anomalies recorded in ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from bristlecone pines in California. Tsunami deposits found on coastlines throughout the eastern Mediterranean provide evidence that the Theran eruption generated massive waves that swept across the Aegean and beyond. These deposits, layers of marine sand and shells found far inland and well above normal high tide levels, mark the passage of waves that may have reached heights of over 100 feet in some locations. The tsunamis would have struck coastal settlements with little warning, erasing harbors and beaches that had supported Bronze Age maritime culture for centuries. The Minoan Linear. A script, found on tablets throughout their former territory, remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing unsolved puzzles. Unlike the later Linear B script used by Mycenaean Greeks, Linear A has resisted all attempts at decipherment. The clay tablets that preserve this writing system record transactions, inventories, and administrative details from a civilization that managed complex economic networks without leaving behind any literature that modern scholars can read. These silent archives hint at sophisticated bureaucracies, religious practices, and social structures that vanished with the people who created them. On Crete, The largest Minoan settlements show evidence of decline that began before the Thiran eruption and continued for centuries afterward. Palaces that once housed elaborate court ceremonies were abandoned or destroyed. Their frescoes left to fade in empty rooms where princes once held audience. The causes of this broader Minoan collapse remain debated: climate change, internal conflict, invasion by Mycenaean Greeks, or some combination of factors that left the civilization vulnerable when natural disaster struck their northern outposts. In the sediment cores extracted from the deepest parts of the Aegean Sea, the Theran eruption appears as a distinct white layer of volcanic glass sandwiched between darker marine deposits. This marker horizon allows geologists to synchronize events across the entire eastern Mediterranean, providing a timestamp more precise than radiocarbon dating for archaeological sites of the Late Bronze Age. The ash layer serves as a geological bookmark, marking the exact moment when one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations encountered forces beyond their control or comprehension. Modern volcanologists studying Santorini's caldera recognize that the island remains active, with underwater fumaroles still venting heated water into the Aegean. The circular bay that now forms the island's heart is actually a collapsed magma chamber, flooded by seawater after the Bronze Age eruption. Beneath this deceptively calm lagoon, magma continues its patient accumulation, building pressure for future eruptions that will add new chapters to the Mediterranean's long geological memory. In the Academy of Athens, sometime around 360 BCE, an aging philosopher named Plato sits in dappled sunlight filtering through olive groves, contemplating the nature of ideal societies and the fragility of human achievement. The scrolls before him contain dialogues that will outlive empires, conversations between his teacher Socrates and various Athenian intellectuals, exploring questions of justice, knowledge, and the proper ordering of states. Among these philosophical investigations, almost as an afterthought, Plato introduces a story that will captivate human imagination for over 2 millennia, the tale of Atlantis, a great island civilization destroyed by the gods for its hubris and corruption. The story emerges in 2 of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, presented as ancient wisdom preserved by Egyptian priests at Sais in the Nile Delta. According to Plato's account, these priests possessed records stretching back 9,000 years before his own time, documenting civilizations that predated Greek memory by millennia. The priest Sonchus tells the Athenian lawgiver Solon about Atlantis, a maritime empire larger than Libya and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, possessed of advanced technology and immense wealth, ultimately destroyed in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods around 9,600 BCE. Plato's description of Atlantis reads like a masterclass in world-building, complete with precise geographical details, complex political structures, and elaborate religious practices. The island consists of concentric rings of land and water, with the royal palace at its center, surrounded by walls plated with brass, tin, and orichalcum, a mysterious metal more precious than gold. Canals connect the rings, allowing ships to sail from the outer ocean to the heart of the capital city. The Atlanteans possess advanced metallurgy, sophisticated agriculture, and a powerful navy that conquers much of the Mediterranean world before divine judgment strikes their homeland. The numerical precision of Plato's account, 9,000 years before Solon's time, islands larger than Libya and Asia, armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, serves a philosophical rather than historical purpose. These vast scales emphasize the magnitude of human achievement and its ultimate insignificance before divine justice. The number 9 itself held sacred significance in ancient Greek thought, representing completion and perfection. While the multiplication by thousands transforms historical time into mythical time, placing events beyond the reach of ordinary human memory, Egyptian temple records from Sais do preserve lengthy king lists and historical chronicles, carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls and written on papyrus scrolls that stretched back centuries before Plato's birth. These archives documented floods of the Nile, wars with neighboring kingdoms, and the rise and fall of dynasties with meticulous attention to chronology. However, no existing Egyptian text contains any reference to Atlantis. Despite the survival of thousands of papyri and inscriptions from the period when such records supposedly existed, the mystery deepens when scholars examine Plato's sources and methods. Unlike his contemporaries, Herodotus and Thucydides, who traveled extensively to gather information for their histories, Plato shows little interest in empirical research or fact-checking. His dialogues prioritize philosophical truth over historical accuracy, using stories and allegories to illustrate abstract principles rather than document actual events. The Atlantis narrative fits perfectly within this pedagogical framework, serving as a cautionary tale about the corruption of ideal states rather than a genuine historical account. Archaeological evidence from the Mediterranean world of 9600 BCE, the period when Plato claims Atlantis flourished and vanished, reveals a landscape utterly unlike his description. At that time, the last ice age was ending, sea levels were rising, and human societies consisted of small hunter-gatherer bands possessing stone tools and basic pottery. No civilization existed with the technological sophistication, political complexity, or maritime capabilities that Plato attributes to Atlantis. The very concept of large-scale agriculture, monumental architecture, and organized states would not emerge in the Mediterranean for another 6,000 years. Yet Plato's narrative incorporates elements that ring true to modern archaeological understanding of Bronze Age civilizations. The emphasis on maritime trade, the importance of metallurgy, the complex relationship between religious and political authority, all these features characterize actual ancient societies that flourished in the Eastern Mediterranean during the 2nd millennium BCE. The destruction of Atlantis by earthquakes and floods parallels the documented collapse of several Bronze Age civilizations, including the Minoans of Crete and the Hittites of Anatolia, both devastated by natural disasters and subsequent social upheaval. The transmission of the Atlantis story through Egyptian priests also reflects genuine patterns of cultural exchange between Greece and Egypt during the Archaic period. Greek intellectuals, including the historical Solon, did travel to Egypt seeking ancient wisdom, and Egyptian temples did preserve historical records of impressive antiquity. However, these cultural connections make Plato's fabrication more plausible rather than proving its authenticity. He possessed enough knowledge of Egyptian practices to construct a convincing fictional framework for his philosophical allegory. Modern Plato scholars recognize Atlantis as a literary device rather than a historical account, pointing to the story's perfect integration with the philosophical themes of the Timaeus and Critias dialogues. The rise and fall of Atlantis illustrates Plato's theory of political decline. While its advanced technology demonstrates his interest in the relationship between knowledge and power, the civilization's ultimate destruction serves as a warning about the dangers of material prosperity divorced from spiritual wisdom, a central concern throughout Plato's political philosophy. The enduring appeal of Atlantis reflects humanity's fascination with lost civilizations and vanished golden ages. Every generation rediscovers Plato's story and interprets it according to contemporary concerns, whether colonial expansion, technological progress, environmental destruction, or social collapse. The very vagueness of Plato's geographical descriptions allows Atlantis to be relocated anywhere human imagination desires, from the Atlantic Ocean to Antarctica, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, always just beyond the reach of definitive disproof. In the manuscript, traditions that preserved Plato's dialogues through the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of medieval Christianity, scribes faithfully copied the Atlantis narrative alongside his discussions of mathematical philosophy and political theory. These medieval scholars, lacking the archaeological evidence that would later illuminate Bronze Age civilizations, accepted Atlantis as historical fact, incorporating it into world chronicles that traced human history from the biblical creation to their own times. Only with the development of modern critical scholarship would Atlantis retreat from history into the realm of philosophical allegory, where Plato originally intended it to reside. Beneath the waters of Alexandria's harbor, where Cleopatra's palaces once overlooked one of the ancient world's busiest ports, marine archaeologists swim through royal chambers that have been submerged for over 1,000 years. Their diving lights illuminate granite columns still bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions, marble statues with faces worn smooth by centuries of Mediterranean currents, and paved courtyards where fish now school above mosaics that once reflected torchlight during imperial banquets. This is Anti-Rhodos, the royal quarter of ancient Alexandria, swallowed by earthquakes and rising seas that transformed one of antiquity's greatest cities into an underwater museum. The submersion of Alexandria's eastern harbor represents only one example of a phenomenon that has shaped Mediterranean coastlines throughout recorded history. Unlike Plato's fictional Atlantis, these drowned cities left behind tangible evidence of their existence: stone foundations, ceramic sherds, and bronze artifacts that resist the sea's patient dissolution. The process of their drowning was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather the result of geological subsidence, earthquakes, and the gradual rise of sea levels that has continued since the end of the last ice age with imperceptible but relentless persistence. Off the coast of southern Greece, in the waters near Peloponnese, lies Pavlopetri, perhaps the world's oldest submerged town, dating to around 2800 BCE. This Bronze Age settlement rests beneath only 12 feet of water, its stone foundations and street layouts still clearly visible to underwater archaeologists equipped with scuba gear and underwater cameras. The town's preservation results from the gentle nature of its submersion, slow enough that sediment buried and protected the structures before marine erosion could destroy them, yet complete enough that the site remained hidden until aerial photography in the 1960s revealed geometric patterns on the seafloor that could only be artificial. The discovery of Pavlopetri revolutionized understanding of Bronze Age urban planning, revealing sophisticated knowledge of water management, defensive architecture, and commercial organization among Mediterranean peoples 4,000 years ago. Underwater excavations have uncovered evidence of olive oil production, ceramic workshops, and storage facilities that supported a population engaged in both local agriculture and long-distance trade. The site's submersion preserved organic materials that rarely survive in terrestrial archaeological contexts: wooden beams, rope fragments, and even ancient seeds that provide direct evidence of Bronze Age diet and technology. Along the coast of Egypt, the ancient city of Heraklion, known to the Greeks as Thonis, slumbers beneath Abu Qir Bay, 30 feet below the surface of waters that once lapped at its temple steps. This was Egypt's primary Mediterranean port before the founding of Alexandria, a cosmopolitan center where Greek merchants traded with Egyptian priests and Phoenician sailors loaded ships with grain destined for cities throughout the ancient world. The city's gradual subsidence began during the Roman period, accelerated by earthquakes that liquefied the Nile Delta's saturated sediments, causing entire neighborhoods to sink as if swallowed by quicksand. French marine archaeologist Franck Godillot's expeditions to Heraklion have recovered colossal statues of pharaohs and gods, bronze temple decorations, and thousands of everyday objects that illuminate daily life in a multicultural port city. The most remarkable finds include intact wooden ships, their hulls preserved in the anaerobic mud of the harbor bottom, loaded with amphora that still contain traces of the wines, oils, and perfumes they carried when the city's docks bustled with international commerce. These vessels provide unprecedented insights into ancient shipbuilding techniques and trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world centuries before the Roman Empire. The Black Sea preserves even more extraordinary examples of underwater archaeological sites, where the absence of wood-eating organisms in the deep, oxygen-poor water has created conditions approaching perfect preservation. At depths exceeding 500 feet, ancient shipwrecks rest on the seafloor with their masts still standing, their rigging intact, and their cargo holds filled with amphora arranged exactly as they were loaded centuries ago. Some of these vessels date to the classical period, carrying Greek wine and olive oil to colonies around the Black Sea, while others represent Byzantine trading expeditions that connected Constantinople to the distant shores of the Caucasus. The most remarkable Black Sea discovery occurred in 2018, when archaeologists located a Greek merchant vessel from around 400 BCE lying intact at a depth of over 7,000 feet. The ship's preservation is so complete that even the rope still coils around wooden cleats, and the steering oars remain lashed to the stern. This vessel matches almost exactly the ship depicted on ancient Greek pottery, showing Odysseus tied to the mast while listening to the siren's song, a connection that bridges archaeology and literature in ways that illuminate both Homer's accuracy in describing contemporary shipping and the reality of ancient maritime technology. In the Western Mediterranean, Roman coastal settlements lie submerged along shorelines from Spain to Tunisia, their mosaic floors and villa foundations marking high watermarks from an era when sea levels stood several feet lower than today. These sites preserve evidence of Roman hydraulic engineering, including harbor installations, fish ponds, and elaborate Nymphia decorative fountains and pools that once graced seaside estates. The gradual submersion of these facilities allows archaeologists to study Roman concrete technology, including their use of volcanic ash that created waterproof mortars still intact after 2 millennia of immersion. The systematic study of these drowned settlements reveals patterns that extend far beyond individual archaeological sites. The Mediterranean has been rising at an average rate of 1.5 millimeters per year for the past 2,000 years. While tectonic subsidence adds another variable that affects different coastlines at different rates, the cumulative effect has submerged approximately 6 feet of coastal area since Roman times, drowning not just individual structures, but entire landscapes that supported ancient agriculture, harbors that facilitated commerce, and residential districts that housed thousands of inhabitants. Modern technology continues to reveal new underwater archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean. Side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and remotely operated vehicles allow archaeologists to explore depths that were previously inaccessible, discovering settlements and harbors that have lain hidden since antiquity. Each new site adds detail to the emerging picture of ancient Mediterranean civilization, not as a series of isolated city-states, but as an interconnected world where ideas, goods, and people moved across water with a freedom that the modern world, with its borders and bureaucracies, has only recently begun to recapture. The preservation of these underwater sites depends on the same geological processes that drowned them. The protective blanket of sediment that covers most submerged structures creates anaerobic conditions that prevent decay, while the constant temperature and salinity of deep water provide stable environments for organic preservation. However, this protection is not permanent rising sea levels, increasing storm activity, and human activities like fishing and tourism threaten these irreplaceable time capsules with destruction more rapid than the geological processes that created them. The Mediterranean coastline that greets modern tourists bears little resemblance to the shores known by ancient mariners. Since the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels have risen over 400 feet, drowning river valleys, flooding coastal plains, and transforming the geography of human civilization. This inexorable rise continues today at a pace measured in millimeters per year, imperceptible to human senses, yet relentless as the retreat of glaciers that began when woolly mammoths still roamed European steppes and early humans painted masterpieces on cave walls in southern France. The mechanism driving this transformation operates on scales that dwarf human experience. During the last glacial maximum, ice sheets over a mile thick covered much of northern Europe and North America, locking up so much of Earth's water that ocean levels dropped to expose vast continental shelves now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of seawater. The weight of these ice sheets pressed down on the continents with crushing force, while the reduced ocean volume meant that areas now submerged were dry land supporting forests, rivers, and the seasonal migrations of animals that left their bones in sediments now accessible only to deep-sea drilling rigs. As global temperatures began their slow climb toward modern levels, the great ice sheets started their equally gradual retreat. Meltwater carved channels through landscapes that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years, carrying sediment loads that turned rivers into torrents of liquid earth. This water had only one destination: the world's oceans, which began to rise at rates that varied with the speed of melting but averaged several meters per century during the most rapid phases of deglaciation. For early human societies adapting to post-glacial environments, rising seas represented not a crisis but simply the natural state of a changing world. The Black Sea preserves the most dramatic example of how rapidly these water levels could rise. Around 600 years ago, when Neolithic farmers were establishing the first agricultural villages across southeastern Europe, the Black Sea existed as a much smaller freshwater lake sitting roughly 400 feet below its current level. Melting ice from the retreating European glaciers had raised the level of the Mediterranean to the point where seawater finally breached the rocky barrier at the Bosphorus, sending a cascade of salt water into the Black Sea basin that may have raised water levels by several feet per day. Geological evidence for this catastrophic flooding comes from sediment cores that show a sharp transition from freshwater lake deposits to marine sediments rich in saltwater organisms. The boundary between these layers is so abrupt that it suggests the transformation occurred within decades rather than centuries. Underwater archaeological surveys have discovered what appear to be the remains of Neolithic settlements on the Black Sea shelf, buried beneath sediments deposited during the initial flooding and subsequent centuries of gradual adjustment to the new water level. The flooding of the Black Sea basin represents only the most dramatic example of how rising seas transform the post-glacial landscape. Throughout the Mediterranean, river valleys that had been carved deep into exposed continental shelves during the Ice Age became drowned estuaries as rising water invaded the land. The Rhone Valley extended over 60 miles farther into what is now the Gulf of Lion, while the Nile Delta was much smaller, with the river flowing through a canyon that is now buried beneath hundreds of feet of marine sediment and the accumulated silt of 5,000 years of annual floods. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the world's earliest farming communities may lie buried beneath these drowned coastal plains. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture occurred precisely during the period of most rapid sea level rise, between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. Fertile river deltas and coastal lowlands would have provided ideal environments for experimenting with plant and animal domestication, But these very areas were most vulnerable to flooding as global ice sheets continued their retreat toward modern dimensions. The Persian Gulf offers another compelling example of landscapes lost to rising seas. During the last ice age, this body of water did not exist. The entire region was a river valley watered by the combined flows of the Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers that now empty into the Gulf. This ancient river system, which geologists call the Kuwait River, flowed southeast through a landscape of freshwater marshes and woodlands that supported diverse wildlife populations and possibly some of humanity's earliest agricultural experiments. As sea levels rose, this river valley flooded gradually from the south, creating a series of freshwater and brackish lakes before finally becoming the saltwater gulf known to history. Mesopotamian flood myths, including the story that inspired the biblical account of Noah's Ark, may preserve cultural memories of this transformation not as a sudden deluge, but as the slow submersion of a familiar landscape over centuries that spanned dozens of human generations. The story of a great flood that destroyed the world takes on different meaning when understood as the gradual drowning of the only world that early agricultural societies had ever known. Coastal archaeological sites throughout the Mediterranean region show evidence of repeated adaptation to rising seas. Ancient harbors lie submerged beneath modern ports, their stone quays and breakwaters now serving as foundations for medieval and modern construction. Roman fish ponds along the Italian coast, designed to be filled by high tides, now rest permanently underwater, their geometric outlines still visible to underwater archaeologists exploring what were once the margins of imperial estates. The rate of sea level rise has varied dramatically over the past 20,000 years, sometimes accelerating during periods of rapid ice sheet collapse, sometimes slowing when the remaining glaciers reached temporary equilibrium with prevailing climate conditions. The most recent acceleration began during the Industrial Age, as human activities started to influence global climate in addition to the natural processes that had been driving deglaciation for millennia. Current rates of rise, measured by satellite altimetry and coastal tide gauges, suggest that the Mediterranean will continue to claim coastal areas at an accelerating pace throughout the coming centuries. Modern coastal cities throughout the Mediterranean face the same fundamental challenge that confronted their ancient predecessors, adapting to the reality of an ocean that refuses to respect human concepts of permanence. Venice struggles with aqua alta flooding that grows more frequent each decade, while low-lying neighborhoods in Alexandria and Thessaloniki experience storm surges that penetrate farther inland with each passing year. These modern concerns echo ancient patterns of adaptation and abandonment that have shaped Mediterranean civilization since the first farmers settled along shores that no longer exist. The geological record preserved in sediment cores reveals that sea level change operates according to rhythms that transcend human history. Ice ages and interglacials cycle with Milankovitch regularity, driven by subtle variations in Earth's orbit that accumulate over tens of thousands of years to produce dramatic changes in global climate and ocean levels. The current interglacial period, which has lasted roughly 12,000 years, represents only the latest chapter in a story of advancing and retreating seas that stretches back through geological time to epochs when no land animals existed to witness the patient transformation of continents by the rise and fall of ancient oceans. The Black Sea holds within its deepest waters a secret that transforms our understanding of how quickly the ancient world could change. Beneath the surface of what appears to be an ordinary inland sea lies evidence of one of the most dramatic geographical transformations in human memory, the catastrophic flooding of a vast freshwater lake that may have inspired the flood myths found in cultures throughout the ancient Near East. The story begins roughly 600 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters finally breached the rocky barrier separating Europe from Asia at the narrow strait now called the Bosphorus. Before this breach, the Black Sea existed as Lake Euxine, a body of fresh water roughly half its current size, fed by rivers draining the Pontic steppes and sitting nearly 400 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence suggests that this lake supported thriving Neolithic communities along its shores. Settlements engaged in the earliest experiments with agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent architecture. These communities had no reason to suspect that their familiar landscape balanced on the edge of a transformation that would reshape the geography of southeastern Europe within a few human lifetimes. The mechanism of the flooding reflects the inexorable physics of water seeking its level. As global sea levels continued to rise following the end of the last ice age, Mediterranean waters climbed higher along the coastlines of what are now Turkey and Greece. At the Bosphorus, a ridge of resistant rock had long prevented the Mediterranean from draining into the lower Black Sea basin, but erosion works with geological patience, wearing away barriers grain by grain until the critical threshold is crossed. When the breach finally occurred, it initiated a process that modern hydrological models suggest may have raised Black Sea levels by as much as several feet per day during its most intense phases. The scale of this flood dwarfs anything in recorded human experience. Computer simulations based on the topography of the Bosphorus Channel and the volume differential between the two bodies of water suggest that, at peak flow, roughly 200 times more water poured through the strait than currently flows over Niagara Falls. The sound of this cascade would have been audible for hundreds of miles, a continuous roar that accompanied the transformation of familiar landscapes into an alien seascape advancing with the relentlessness of a slow-motion tsunami. Marine geologists studying sediment cores from the Black Sea floor have identified the precise moment when salt water first entered the freshwater lake. The boundary appears as a sharp transition from lake sediments rich in freshwater organisms to marine deposits containing the shells of saltwater mollusks that colonize the rapidly expanding sea. This sedimentary boundary, found consistently across cores taken from different parts of the Black Sea, suggests that the transition from lake to sea occurred within decades rather than centuries, rapid enough that individual humans would have witnessed the complete transformation of their world. The flooding did not affect all areas equally. River valleys that had been carved into the lake floor during periods of low water became deep underwater canyons, while higher ground became islands that were gradually submerged as water levels continued to rise toward their modern elevation. The Danube River, which had flowed into Lake Euxine through a valley now buried beneath 300 feet of water, found its mouth pushed hundreds of miles upstream as the expanding sea invaded the river's lower course with salt water that killed freshwater fish and forced human settlements to relocate again and again. Underwater archaeological surveys conducted by marine archaeologists using remotely operated vehicles have discovered what appear to be the remains of pre-flood settlements on the Black Sea continental shelf. These sites, buried beneath layers of sediment deposited during and after the initial flooding, preserve evidence of Neolithic technology stone tools, ceramic vessels, and the post holes of wooden structures that once stood in river valleys, now lying beneath hundreds of feet of seawater. The preservation conditions in the Black Sea's oxygen-poor deep water are so exceptional that organic materials from these sites remain intact after nearly 8 millennia of submersion. The human impact of the Black Sea flood may have extended far beyond the immediate region through massive population movements triggered by the loss of familiar territory. Genetic studies of modern European populations suggest that major migrations occurred during the period following the flood, as displaced communities carried their agricultural knowledge and cultural traditions into regions that had previously been occupied primarily by hunter-gatherer societies. These migrations may have accelerated the spread of farming throughout temperate Europe, as refugees from the flooded Black Sea region established new settlements and shared their agricultural innovations with indigenous populations. The flood's influence on human culture may be preserved in the mythological traditions of multiple ancient civilizations. The Epic of Gilgamesh. With its account of Utnapishtim surviving a great deluge, originates from Mesopotamian cultures whose ancestors may have witnessed the Black Sea transformation. The biblical story of Noah's Ark contains details the dove returning with an olive branch, the ark coming to rest on a mountain that some scholars interpret as culturally preserved memories of actual flooding events. Even the Greek myth of Deucalion's flood may reflect distant memories of the Black Sea catastrophe, transmitted through oral traditions that preserve the essential narrative while losing the precise geographical context. The Black Sea flood also demonstrates how quickly stable environments can be disrupted by processes that operate beyond human control or comprehension. The Neolithic communities living around Lake Euxinus possessed sophisticated knowledge of their local environment. They knew when to plant crops, where to find fresh water, how to predict seasonal changes in weather and wildlife behavior. Yet all this accumulated wisdom became useless when the fundamental parameters of their world changed within a single human lifetime. The advancing waters forced the abandonment of settlements that had been occupied for generations, drowning agricultural fields that had been carefully cleared and cultivated, submerging sacred sites where ancestors had been buried according to traditions stretching back to the beginning of farming itself. Modern studies of the Black Sea's unique oceanography reveal that the flood's effects persist in the sea's current structure. The deep waters remain stratified, with a layer of dense, salty Mediterranean water underlying less dense surface water fed by rivers draining half of Europe. This stratification prevents vertical mixing and creates oxygen-poor conditions in the depths that preserve organic materials with extraordinary fidelity. The hydrogen sulfide produced by bacterial decomposition in these deep waters creates an environment so toxic that complex life cannot survive below roughly 600 feet, a permanent memorial to the violence of the sea's birth. The Black Sea flood represents more than just a regional catastrophe. It exemplifies how the end of the Ice Age continued to reshape human civilization long after the great glaciers had retreated to their modern positions. Sea level rise, climate change, and geographical transformation continued for millennia after the initial deglaciation, creating a dynamic world where human societies had to adapt repeatedly to environmental changes beyond their influence. The communities that witnessed the Black Sea flood were among the last to experience such dramatic geographical transformation. But their experience foreshadowed the environmental challenges that would face human civilization throughout its subsequent development. In the cold waters of the North Sea, where oil rigs now pierce through centuries of accumulated sediment, lies the drowned landscape of Doggerland, a vast plain that once connected Britain to continental Europe with rolling hills, meandering rivers, and forests that supported some of Europe's last hunter-gatherer societies. This lost world, larger than modern England, disappeared beneath rising seas so gradually that its submersion spanned hundreds of human generations, each one adapting to a coastline that retreated a little farther inland with every passing decade. Doggerland takes its name from the Dogger Bank, a shallow area of the North Sea where fishing trawlers regularly brought up in their nets not just fish, but also the bones of mammoths, the antlers of giant deer, and stone tools crafted by Mesolithic peoples who hunted across landscapes now lying beneath 100 feet of seawater. These accidental archaeological discoveries, mixed with modern catches of cod and herring, provide glimpses of an ecosystem that flourished during the early Holocene, when global temperatures were warming, but sea levels had not yet risen to their modern heights. The geography of Doggerland, reconstructed from seismic surveys conducted by petroleum companies searching for North Sea oil deposits, reveals a complex landscape of river systems, lakes, and coastal marshlands that would have provided ideal habitat for the diverse wildlife populations emerging from Ice Age refugia. The Thames and the Rhine flowed together as a single river system, joined by tributaries from across northern Europe, creating a massive watershed that drained into the Atlantic far to the north of their current mouths. Along these rivers, Mesolithic communities established seasonal camps, following herds of red deer and aurochs across territories that spanned what are now separate countries. Archaeological evidence from Doggerland emerges slowly, piece by piece, from the seafloor. In addition to the bones and tools recovered by fishing nets, systematic underwater surveys have located submerged peat deposits that preserve pollen, seeds, and other organic materials from Doggerland's forests and wetlands. These paleo-environmental archives reveal an ecosystem in transition, as pine and birch woodlands gradually gave way to deciduous forests of oak, elm, and hazel, the same succession that characterized post-glacial reforestation throughout northern Europe, but here preserved beneath marine sediments rather than buried by later terrestrial deposits. The most remarkable discovery from Doggerland came in 2010 when marine archaeologists recovered a barbed antler point from the seafloor, a weapon or fishing tool crafted by human hands roughly 10,000 years ago, when the North Sea was still dry land. This artifact, shaped from red deer antler with the same techniques used by Mesolithic peoples throughout northern Europe, provides direct evidence that humans not only lived in Doggerland, but possessed the sophisticated hunting and fishing technologies that characterize the most successful post-glacial societies. The submersion of Doggerland occurred in phases that correspond to the complex patterns of ice sheet melting and sea level rise that characterize the early Holocene. Initially, the region existed as a high plain drained by rivers that carried meltwater from the retreating Scandinavian ice sheet. As global sea levels rose, the North Sea began to invade this landscape from the north, creating a series of bays and estuaries that gradually expanded inland. The process was slow enough that human societies could adapt by moving their settlements to higher ground, but relentless enough that each generation faced the loss of familiar territories to the advancing sea. Climate change accelerated the transformation of Doggerland through mechanisms that extended beyond simple sea level rise. As global temperatures warmed, permafrost that had stabilized the landscape during the Ice Age began to thaw, causing widespread subsidence in areas that had been frozen for millennia. Coastal erosion intensified as storm patterns shifted in response to changing atmospheric circulation, while increased precipitation raised river levels and expanded wetland areas throughout the region. The combined effect of these changes transformed Doggerland from a stable terrestrial environment into an unstable coastal zone vulnerable to rapid flooding. The final submersion of Doggerland may have been hastened by a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known to geologists as the Storegga Slide. Around 8,200 years ago, an area of seafloor sediment roughly the size of Scotland collapsed into the deeper waters of the Norwegian Sea, generating a tsunami that swept across the North Sea with waves reaching heights of over 60 feet along some coastlines. While Doggerland was already largely submerged by this time, the Storegga tsunami would have completed the destruction of any remaining terrestrial areas, drowning the last islands and coastal settlements beneath waters that would never again recede. The human response to Doggerland's submersion can be traced through archaeological sites along the present-day coastlines of Britain, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Mesolithic settlements from the period of Doggerland's final submersion show evidence of increasingly maritime adaptations, sophisticated boat-building technologies, specialized fishing equipment, and settlement patterns focused on coastal resources rather than terrestrial hunting. These societies developed what archaeologists call the Maglemosian culture, characterized by advanced woodworking techniques, elaborate bone and antler tools, and artistic traditions that suggest complex social structures capable of transmitting specialized knowledge across generations. The genetic legacy of Doggerland's inhabitants persists in modern European populations, providing evidence that the submersion of their homeland did not result in population extinction, but rather in dispersal and integration with other Mesolithic communities. DNA studies suggest that the hunter-gatherers who witnessed Doggerland's final submersion contributed significantly to the ancestry of subsequent Neolithic farming populations, indicating that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture in Northern Europe involved not just the spread of new technologies, but also the survival and adaptation of indigenous knowledge systems. Modern reconstructions of Doggerland's ecology reveal an environment of extraordinary biological diversity, supporting species assemblages that no longer exist anywhere in Europe. Vast herds of aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, grazed across grasslands, maintained by seasonal flooding and natural fires. European lions, now extinct, hunted in forests that provided habitat for straight-tusked elephants and giant beavers. The loss of this ecosystem represents one of the most significant biodiversity reductions in post-glacial Europe, as the submersion of Doggerland eliminated habitats that had supported large mammal populations for thousands of years. The study of Doggerland continues to evolve as new technologies allow more sophisticated exploration of submerged landscapes. High-resolution seismic imaging reveals river channels, lake beds, and even possible archaeological sites beneath the North Sea sediments, while advances in underwater robotics make systematic excavation of submerged sites increasingly feasible. Each new discovery adds detail to our understanding of how early European societies adapted to environmental change, and how the geography of human civilization has been shaped by forces operating on scales far beyond individual human experience. The story of Doggerland's submersion resonates with contemporary concerns about sea level rise and climate change, demonstrating that the transformation of familiar landscapes by rising seas is not an unprecedented threat, but rather a recurring theme in human history. The Mesolithic peoples who watched their world disappear beneath the waves possessed neither the technology nor the social organization to prevent this transformation, yet they succeeded in adapting to new environments and preserving their cultural heritage through migration and integration with other communities. Their experience offers both sobering lessons about the inevitability of environmental change and inspiring examples of human resilience in the face of forces beyond human control. Along the coastlines of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates grind against each other with the patience of geological time, ancient peoples developed sophisticated systems for preserving memories of catastrophic events that recurred across centuries. In Japan, stone monuments called tsunami ishi stand on hillsides far from modern shorelines, bearing inscriptions that warn future generations never to build below these markers. Some of these stones are over 600 years old, yet they mark elevations reached by waves that seem impossible until the ocean demonstrates once again that human concepts of possibility mean nothing to the physics of displaced water. The coral atolls of the Pacific preserve their own archives of ancient tsunamis in formations that require no human interpretation. On islands throughout Polynesia, geologists discover massive coral blocks weighing several tons resting hundreds of yards inland and dozens of feet above normal high tide levels. These coral missiles, torn from offshore reefs by tsunami waves and hurled across coastal plains with the force of liquid mountains, mark the passage of events that dwarf anything in recorded Pacific history. Radiocarbon dating of the coral growth rings reveals that some of these deposits formed thousands of years ago, during prehistoric seismic events that shook the entire Pacific basin. The most remarkable natural archive of tsunami history lies in the sediment layers of coastal marshes and lagoons throughout the Pacific Rim. Here, in quiet backwaters protected from normal wave action, Each major tsunami leaves a distinctive signature, a layer of marine sand containing microscopic marine organisms, deposited far inland when oceanic waters briefly invaded terrestrial environments. These tsunami deposits, sandwiched between normal marsh sediments rich in freshwater diatoms and terrestrial pollen, provide precise timing for prehistoric seismic events that occurred centuries or millennia before human observers began keeping written records. In the Cascade Range of the Pacific Northwest, Native American oral traditions preserve detailed accounts of the last great earthquake and tsunami to strike the region. The stories, passed down through dozens of generations of Makah, Kino, and other coastal peoples, describe a winter night when the earth shook so violently that entire forests slid into the sea, followed by waves that swept miles inland, destroying villages and transforming familiar landscapes into alien seascapes. These oral histories, initially dismissed by European settlers as mythology, gained new credibility when geological evidence confirmed that the Cascadia subduction zone generated a magnitude 9.0 earthquake on January 26, 1700, an event recorded not only in Pacific Northwest tsunami deposits, but also in Japanese historical documents that describe a mysterious tsunami arriving without any local earthquake to explain its origin. The Japanese tsunami records, maintained with characteristic precision by generations of scholars and government officials, provide one of the world's longest continuous archives of seismic sea waves. Documents dating back over 1,000 years describe the height, inland penetration, and human impact of dozens of tsunami events, creating a database that allows modern seismologists to calculate return intervals for catastrophic earthquakes along different segments of Japan's tectonically active coastline. These records reveal that major tsunami-generating earthquakes recur with irregular but measurable frequency roughly every 300 to 600 years for the largest events, but with enough variation that precise prediction remains impossible. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami demonstrated how quickly modern societies can forget lessons preserved in traditional knowledge systems. Along coastlines that had been struck by similar waves in 1861, 1797, and earlier centuries, tourist resorts and fishing villages were built at elevations that indigenous peoples had long considered dangerous. In contrast, the Moken Sea nomads of the Andaman Sea, whose oral traditions contained detailed instructions for recognizing tsunami warning signs, suffered virtually no casualties because their cultural memory had preserved knowledge of how the ocean behaves when submarine earthquakes displace massive volumes of water. Coral growth patterns in the Central Pacific provide another form of natural chronometer for prehistoric tsunamis. The annual growth bands in massive coral heads, like tree rings, record environmental conditions year by year, sometimes for centuries. When tsunami waves tear across coral reefs, they leave scars in the coral growth record bands of disrupted growth that mark the exact year when catastrophic waves swept across previously stable reef environments. These coral calendars, combined with radiocarbon dating of tsunami deposits on nearby shores, allow scientists to construct detailed chronologies of prehistoric seismic activity throughout Polynesia and Micronesia. The Hawaiian Islands, despite their location in the middle of the Pacific, far from major fault systems, bear evidence of tsunami events that boggle comprehension. On the island of Lanai, marine deposits containing coral fragments and deep-sea sediments rest at elevations over 1,000 feet above current sea level. These deposits, initially interpreted as evidence of ancient high sea levels, are now understood to record the passage of mega-tsunamis generated by massive underwater landslides. When portions of Hawaiian volcanoes collapse into the deep ocean, an inevitable consequence of volcanic islands growing beyond the structural limits of their foundations, they displace volumes of water sufficient to generate waves that sweep completely over low-lying islands and reach incredible elevations on mountainous coastlines. Archaeological evidence from Pacific Island cultures reveals sophisticated adaptive strategies developed by peoples who lived with the constant threat of seismic sea waves. Traditional architecture in tsunami-prone regions emphasized flexibility over permanent buildings designed to be quickly dismantled and moved to higher ground, constructed with materials that could be easily replaced after catastrophic flooding. Settlement patterns avoided the most fertile coastal plains in favor of elevated terraces that provided safety at the cost of agricultural productivity. These adaptations, developed through centuries of experience with recurring natural disasters, demonstrate how human societies can successfully coexist with geological processes that operate on timescales far longer than individual human lifespans. The study of prehistoric tsunamis reveals that the modern Pacific, for all its apparent serenity, exists in a temporary lull between catastrophic events that will inevitably recur. The tectonic forces that generate earthquakes and volcanic eruptions operate according to stress accumulation patterns that unfold over centuries, building toward critical thresholds that will be exceeded regardless of human activities or intentions. Paleoseismic research suggests that the intervals between major tsunami events may be shortening in some regions, possibly due to changes in stress patterns caused by post-glacial rebound, sea level rise, or other factors that alter the delicate balance of forces acting on submarine fault systems. Modern tsunami warning systems, for all their technological sophistication, cannot match the temporal depth of natural archives that preserve evidence of prehistoric events exceeding anything in recorded history. Satellite communication networks and deep ocean pressure sensors provide real-time detection of tsunami-generating events, but they cannot predict the location or timing of future catastrophic earthquakes. The geological record suggests that societies throughout the Pacific Rim will continue to face tsunami threats that exceed the parameters of current emergency planning, making the traditional knowledge preserved in oral histories and cultural practices more relevant than ever for long-term survival in tectonically active regions. The coral blocks resting on Pacific islands, the tsunami stones standing sentinel on Japanese hillsides, and the sediment layers accumulating in coastal marshes all speak the same message in the patient language of geological time. The earth will shake, the ocean will rise, and coastal civilizations will face the recurring challenge of adapting to forces that operate according to schedules written in the slow accumulation of tectonic stress rather than the brief span of human memory. In laboratories around the world, geneticists extract DNA from ancient bones found in caves that were once above sea level, from sediment cores taken from continental shelves now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, and from the genomes of modern populations whose ancestors witnessed landscapes that exist now only in the chemical signatures written in their chromosomes. These molecular archives preserve stories of human dispersal and adaptation that complement the physical evidence found in submerged archaeological sites, revealing how rising seas have shaped not just the geography of human civilization, but the very genetic structure of our species. The most compelling evidence comes from studies of mitochondrial DNA genetic material passed down through the maternal line that accumulates mutations at predictable rates, creating a molecular clock that can date population movements and demographic changes with remarkable precision. When geneticists analyze the mitochondrial sequences of coastal populations throughout the world, they discover patterns that reflect repeated episodes of population bottlenecks and rapid expansion. Exactly what would be expected if human societies had repeatedly lost coastal territories to rising seas and then recolonized new areas as their populations recovered and adapted to changed environments. Along the coastlines of Southeast Asia, where the Sunda Shelf once connected the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines in a single landmass, Genetic studies reveal evidence of ancient population movements that correlate precisely with periods of rapid sea level change. The ancestors of modern Austronesian-speaking peoples appear to have island-hopped across increasingly fragmented landscapes as rising seas transformed continental areas into archipelagos, developing the sophisticated maritime technologies that would eventually carry their descendants across the entire Pacific Ocean to settle islands from Easter Island to Madagascar. The genetic signatures of these ancient mariners persist in modern populations throughout the Pacific, but with patterns that suggest multiple waves of migration and colonization rather than a single expansion event. DNA studies indicate that some Pacific Island populations carry genetic markers from very ancient Southeast Asian populations that were isolated on different parts of the fragmenting Sunda Shelf, while others show evidence of more recent admixture with populations that developed advanced sailing technologies during the later phases of sea level rise. These genetic patterns provide a molecular map of how human societies adapted to the loss of familiar coastlines by developing the technologies and cultural practices necessary for life in an increasingly maritime world. The Aboriginal populations of Australia preserve perhaps the most remarkable genetic record of adaptation to changing sea levels. When the first humans reached Australia, roughly 50,000 years ago, sea levels were much lower than today, and the journey from Southeast Asia required crossing only relatively narrow water gaps. However, the ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians became isolated on their continent as rising seas gradually widened the water barriers that separated Australia from Asia, creating the distinctive genetic patterns that characterize Aboriginal populations today. Despite this isolation, genetic studies reveal that Australian Aboriginal populations maintained complex internal patterns of migration and gene flow that suggest sophisticated knowledge of continental geography and seasonal resource availability. The most intriguing genetic evidence comes from studies of European populations that preserve DNA signatures from the hunter-gatherer societies that witnessed the submersion of Doggerland and other coastal areas during the early Holocene. These ancient genetic markers appear in modern populations at frequencies that suggest the displaced coastal peoples did not simply vanish when their territories were submerged, but rather integrated with inland populations, contributing their genetic heritage and presumably their cultural knowledge to the societies that would eventually develop Neolithic agriculture and establish the foundations of European civilization. Recent advances in ancient DNA extraction have made it possible to analyze genetic material directly from human remains found in submerged sites, providing unprecedented insights into the population dynamics of societies that lived along now-drowned coastlines. Bones recovered from underwater caves and submerged settlements contain DNA that can be compared with both ancient and modern populations, revealing patterns of migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that operated on scales ranging from local communities to entire continents. The most surprising discoveries have come from studies of populations that lived in areas now far from any coastline. Genetic analysis of ancient remains from highland regions of Europe, Asia, and the Americas reveals that many inland populations carry genetic markers characteristic of coastal peoples, suggesting that the displacement caused by rising seas triggered population movements that penetrated deep into continental interiors. These genetic signatures provide evidence for migration patterns that would be invisible in the archaeological record, particularly in regions where acidic soils have destroyed bone and other organic materials that might preserve direct evidence of ancient population movements. Computational models that combine genetic data with archaeological evidence and paleoclimatic reconstructions are beginning to reveal the full complexity of how sea level change has influenced human evolution and dispersal. These studies suggest that periods of rapid sea level rise may have accelerated human cultural and technological development by forcing coastal populations to develop more sophisticated tools, social organizations, and environmental knowledge necessary for survival in rapidly changing environments. The genetic evidence indicates that some of humanity's most successful adaptive innovations, including advanced boat building, navigation techniques, and agricultural practices, may have originated among populations that were forced to adapt to the loss of coastal territories. The implications of this genetic research extend beyond academic questions about human prehistory to contemporary issues of climate change and sea level rise. The genetic diversity of modern coastal populations reflects thousands of years of adaptation to environmental change, including repeated episodes of displacement and recolonization that have shaped both our physical and cultural evolution. Understanding these ancient patterns of adaptation may provide insights into how modern societies might respond to similar challenges posed by contemporary climate change. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the genetic evidence is how it reveals the resilience and adaptability of human populations faced with environmental changes beyond their control. Rather than simply documenting population crashes and cultural collapse, the DNA preserved in ancient bones and modern genomes tells stories of survival, adaptation, and cultural innovation that enabled human societies not just to survive the submersion of vast coastal areas, but to develop the technologies and social structures that would carry them to every habitable environment on Earth. The molecular clocks embedded in human DNA continue to tick toward an uncertain future, carrying within their chemical structure the accumulated experience of thousands of generations who witnessed the rise of ancient seas. Each mutation, each population bottleneck, and each episode of rapid expansion recorded in our genomes represents decisions made by ancestors who faced environmental challenges with the same fundamental human capacities for adaptation, innovation, and cultural transmission that characterize our species today. Their genetic legacy serves as both a record of past resilience and a resource for understanding how human societies might navigate the environmental changes that await future generations. In the quiet laboratories where geneticists extract ancient DNA from bones that have rested for millennia in underwater caves, the molecular machinery of heredity continues to reveal secrets hidden in the chemical alphabet that connects every living human to ancestors who watched familiar coastlines disappear beneath rising seas. These genetic memories, preserved in the nucleus of every cell, carry forward the accumulated wisdom of populations that learned to thrive in a world where the only constant was the patient transformation of land into sea, and sea back into land, across cycles of change that extend far beyond the brief span of human memory into the deep rhythms of planetary time. In the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, where oil platforms now drill through sediment layers laid down across millennia, lies evidence of one of the most dramatic geographical transformations witnessed by early human societies. Beneath the warm salt water that has connected Mesopotamia to the Indian Ocean throughout recorded history, flows an ancient river system that once drained half of southwestern Asia through landscapes now buried under 200 feet of marine sediment, the Kuwait River. As geologists call this vanished waterway, carved channels through territory that supported some of humanity's earliest experiments with agriculture, animal domestication, and permanent settlement. The Persian Gulf exists today only because global sea levels rose following the end of the last ice age. During the glacial maximum, when vast ice sheets locked up enough of Earth's water to lower ocean levels by over 400 feet, the Gulf was a vast river valley watered by the combined flows of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and numerous smaller rivers that descended from the Zagros Mountains and the highlands of Iran. This river system, larger than the modern Mississippi, flowed southeast through a landscape of freshwater marshes, gallery forests, and seasonal floodplains that provided ideal conditions for the wild ancestors of wheat, barley, and other crops that would become the foundation of agricultural civilization. Archaeological evidence for human occupation of the drowned Gulf comes primarily from sites along its ancient shorelines, now preserved as fossil beaches and river terraces dozens of feet below the current water surface. Underwater surveys using side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profilers have identified what appear to be ancient settlement mounds scattered across the Gulf's floor. Their regular geometric shapes suggesting human construction rather than natural geological formations. These sites, if they prove to be archaeological rather than geological features, would represent some of the world's oldest permanently occupied villages, predating the famous sites of the Fertile Crescent by thousands of years. The submersion of the Persian Gulf occurred in phases that correspond to the complex patterns of ice sheet melting and global sea level rise that characterized the early Holocene. Initially, rising Indian Ocean waters invaded the river valley from the south, creating a series of brackish lagoons and salt marshes that advanced upstream with each century. The process was gradual enough that human communities could adapt by relocating their settlements to higher ground, but persistent enough that each generation faced the loss of familiar territories to the encroaching sea. Sediment cores from the deepest parts of the Gulf preserve a detailed record of this transformation in layers that transition from river sediments rich in freshwater organisms to marine deposits containing the shells of creatures that live only in saltwater environments. The boundary between these sediment types is remarkably sharp, suggesting that the final flooding of the Gulf Basin occurred relatively rapidly once a critical threshold was crossed. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from this boundary layer indicates that the Persian Gulf assumed approximately its modern configuration around 8000 years ago, coinciding with the emergence of the world's first urban civilizations in nearby Mesopotamia. The cultural implications of the Gulf's flooding may extend far beyond the immediate region through its possible influence on the flood myths preserved in ancient Near Eastern literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest known work of literature, describes a great deluge that destroyed an earlier world, with details that some scholars interpret as culturally preserved memories of the Gulf's gradual inundation. The biblical account of Noah's flood, derived from earlier Mesopotamian traditions, contains geographical and ecological details that make sense only in the context of a gradual flooding process rather than the catastrophic deluge described in the narrative itself. The transformation of the Persian Gulf from river valley to marine embayment had profound effects on regional climate patterns that persisted long after the flooding was complete. The presence of a large body of water in the heart of southwestern Asia modified atmospheric circulation patterns, increasing humidity and altering seasonal temperature variations throughout the region. These climatic changes may have contributed to the environmental conditions that supported the development of irrigated agriculture in Mesopotamia, as the Gulf's moderating influence made the region more suitable for intensive farming than it had been during the arid conditions that prevailed when the area was a continental interior. Modern studies of the Gulf's oceanography reveal traces of the ancient river system in current patterns that continue to follow channels carved when the area was dry land. Fresh water from the Tigris and Euphrates, entering the Gulf through the Shat al-Arab, flows along submarine channels that may represent the original course of the Kuwait River. The mixing of fresh and salt water in these channels creates unique ecological conditions that support distinctive communities of marine organisms adapted to varying salinity levels, living remnants of the transition zone that once existed as the ancient river met the advancing sea. The Persian Gulf's transformation also influenced human migration patterns throughout southwestern Asia and beyond. As rising waters gradually reduced the amount of habitable land around the Gulf Basin, displaced populations may have contributed to the spread of agricultural knowledge and technology throughout the region. Genetic studies of modern Middle Eastern populations reveal patterns of ancient migration that correlate with the timing of the Gulf's flooding, suggesting that the submersion of this fertile river valley triggered population movements that carried agricultural innovations as far as the Nile Valley and the Indus River system. Archaeological sites along the present-day coastlines of the Persian Gulf preserve evidence of how human societies adapted to the loss of familiar landscapes through the development of new technologies and social organizations. The world's oldest known pearl diving industry developed in the Gulf region during the period following its flooding, as coastal peoples learned to exploit the unique ecological conditions created by the meeting of fresh and salt water. Similarly, some of the earliest evidence for long-distance maritime trade comes from sites around the Gulf, suggesting that the transformation from a terrestrial to a marine environment stimulated the development of sophisticated nautical technologies. The sedimentary archives preserved beneath the Persian Gulf continue to yield new insights into the environmental conditions that prevailed during humanity's transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and urbanism. Pollen grains extracted from cores taken throughout the Gulf Basin reveal detailed records of vegetation changes that accompanied the flooding, showing how forests and grasslands gave way to salt marshes and marine environments. These paleo-environmental reconstructions provide crucial context for understanding how early agricultural societies adapted to rapidly changing environmental conditions. The story of the Persian Gulf's transformation from river valley to marine embayment demonstrates how profoundly rising seas have shaped the geographical context within which human civilization developed. The fertile river valley that supported some of humanity's earliest agricultural experiments now lies beneath waters that support entirely different ecosystems and human activities. The oil that powers modern industrial civilization accumulated in sedimentary rocks that were deposited millions of years before the Gulf existed in its current form. While the political boundaries that divide the modern Middle East reflect historical patterns of human occupation that developed in response to geographical realities shaped by post-glacial sea level rise. In the warm waters that now cover the ancient Kuwait River Valley, marine archaeologists continue their patient search for direct evidence of the human societies that witnessed one of the most significant geographical transformations in recent Earth history. Each sediment core, each sonar survey, and each underwater excavation adds detail to our understanding of how rising seas have influenced not just the physical geography of human civilization, but the cultural and technological innovations that enabled our species to adapt to environmental changes operating on scales far beyond individual human experience. At the bottom of the world, where the Ross ice shelf extends across an area larger than France, drill cores penetrate through thousands of feet of ice to extract samples from sediment layers that have not seen sunlight for millions of years. These Antarctic archives preserve evidence of climate conditions so different from the continent's current frozen state that they challenge fundamental assumptions about the stability of Earth's polar regions. During periods of elevated global temperatures that occurred as recently as 3 million years ago, Antarctica supported temperate forests, flowing rivers, and possibly even early human-like ancestors who left their traces in sediments now buried beneath the world's largest ice sheet. The discovery of ancient pollen grains in Antarctic sediment cores revolutionized understanding of the continent's climatic history. These microscopic fossils, preserved in perfect detail by the dry, cold conditions that have characterized Antarctica for the past 30 million years, include species that currently grow only in temperate regions of South America and Australia. The presence of beech tree pollen, grass seeds, and even flowering plant remains in sediments dated to the Pliocene epoch suggests that portions of Antarctica experience temperatures warm enough to support vegetation communities similar to those found in modern Tasmania or southern Chile. The implications of a temperate Antarctica extend far beyond botanical curiosity to fundamental questions about global climate stability and the potential for rapid environmental change. Computer models based on Antarctic ice core data and marine sediment records suggest that during the mid-Pliocene warm period, roughly 3.2 million years ago, global temperatures averaged only 2–3 degrees Celsius warmer than today. Yet this modest warming was sufficient to drastically reduce Antarctic ice coverage and raise global sea levels by 75–80 feet above current levels. Such dramatic changes in response to relatively small temperature increases suggest that Earth's climate system may be far more sensitive to warming than previously understood. Archaeological evidence for human presence in Antarctica remains circumstantial but intriguing. Stone tools discovered in Patagonian sites dating to over 1 million years ago demonstrate that early human ancestors possessed the technological capabilities necessary for survival in sub-Antarctic environments. While no direct evidence of human occupation has been found in Antarctica itself, the continent's ice-free valleys and coastal areas would have provided habitable refugia during periods of reduced ice coverage. The genetic diversity of certain Antarctic species, particularly seals and penguins, suggests that these animals survived Ice Age cycles in isolated refugia that might also have supported human populations. The most compelling evidence for ancient human connections to Antarctica comes from the oral traditions of indigenous peoples throughout the Southern Hemisphere. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe a great southern land of ice and fire, while Polynesian navigation chants reference southern stars and ocean currents that would only be visible from latitudes close to Antarctica. Maori legends from New Zealand tell of voyages to lands where the sun never sets descriptions that could reflect actual knowledge of Antarctic summer conditions acquired through long-distance voyaging that extended farther south than any recorded in historical accounts. Recent discoveries in Antarctic dry valleys, where wind and sublimation have removed ice and snow to expose ancient landscapes, reveal geological formations that bear striking resemblances to archaeological sites found in other parts of the world. Stone circles, linear arrangements of rocks, and what appear to be constructed shelters have been photographed in areas of Antarctica that were ice-free during recent warming periods. While these features could result from natural geological processes, their regular patterns and apparent construction techniques warrant investigation by archaeologists trained in recognizing the subtle traces left by early human societies. The preservation conditions in Antarctica surpass those found anywhere else on Earth, creating natural laboratories where organic materials can survive for millions of years in nearly perfect condition. Mummified seals dating to thousands of years ago retain intact DNA, soft tissues, and even stomach contents that provide detailed insights into ancient Antarctic ecosystems. If human remains exist in Antarctica, they would likely be preserved with unprecedented completeness, potentially including DNA, clothing, tools, and other organic materials that rarely survive in other archaeological contexts. Climate reconstructions based on Antarctic ice cores reveal that the continent has experienced numerous warming episodes throughout its geological history, some occurring with rapidity that challenges conventional assumptions about the pace of natural climate change. The last interglacial period, roughly 125,000 years ago, saw Antarctic temperatures rise high enough to significantly reduce ice coverage and raise global sea levels by 20–30 feet. During this period, which lasted roughly 10,000 years, Antarctica may have been habitable for cold-adapted human populations possessing technologies similar to those used by Arctic peoples in more recent times. The study of Antarctic microorganisms has revealed ecosystems of remarkable complexity existing in environments previously thought to be sterile. Bacteria, fungi, and even multicellular organisms thrive in Antarctic rocks, ice, and hypersaline lakes, demonstrating life's ability to persist in conditions that seem utterly hostile to biological activity. These discoveries suggest that even during Antarctica's coldest periods, isolated ecosystems may have provided refugia for more complex organisms, including possibly human populations that developed extreme adaptations for survival in polar environments. Modern genetic studies of Antarctic wildlife reveal patterns of population structure and evolutionary history that suggest much more complex biogeographical relationships than would be expected if the continent had been continuously ice-covered for millions of years. Some Antarctic species show genetic connections to populations in South America, Africa, and Australia that could only have developed through land connections or sustained contact across shorter water gaps during periods of reduced ice coverage. These genetic patterns hint at a dynamic Antarctic environment that periodically supported biological exchange with other continents. The implications of Antarctic climate history for understanding future global change are profound and deeply unsettling. If relatively modest warming could transform Antarctica from a frozen wasteland into a temperate landscape supporting diverse ecosystems, then current trends in global temperature increase could trigger changes in polar ice coverage that would dramatically alter global geography within centuries rather than millennia. The sedimentary records preserved in Antarctic cores suggest that such transformations have occurred repeatedly throughout Earth history, always with consequences that extended far beyond the polar regions to reshape coastlines and climate patterns throughout the world. The search for evidence of ancient human presence in Antarctica continues through increasingly sophisticated remote sensing technologies and targeted excavations in ice-free areas that may have served as refugia during past warming periods. Each new discovery, whether fossilized pollen grains, ancient DNA, or mysterious stone formations, adds to the growing body of evidence that Antarctica's history is far more complex and dynamic than the frozen continent's current appearance would suggest. The ice that now covers 98% of Antarctica may conceal not just evidence of past climate conditions, but also traces of human societies that witnessed and adapted to environmental changes as dramatic as any that Earth has experienced. In the perpetual darkness of Antarctic winter, where temperatures plunge far below the freezing point of mercury and winds howl across ice sheets that have accumulated over millions of years, the continent keeps its secrets locked in frozen archives that yield their information slowly, core by precious core, to scientists who work in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. Yet, beneath the ice, in sediments that remember when Antarctica was green, lies evidence that the frozen continent at the bottom of the world may hold keys to understanding not just where human civilization has been, but where it might be heading as Earth's climate system responds to changes that echo transformations witnessed by ancient ecosystems now sleeping beneath miles of accumulated snow and ice. In the deepest trenches of the world's oceans, where pressures exceed 1000 times those at sea level and temperatures hover just above freezing, sediment accumulates with the patience of geological time, grain by microscopic grain, preserving evidence of environmental changes that extend back through millions of years of Earth history. These abyssal archives, undisturbed by the waves and currents that churn shallower waters, contain within their layers a more complete record of planetary transformation than any library constructed by human hands. Each centimeter of compressed mud represents decades or centuries of quiet deposition, creating timelines so detailed that scientists can read the chemical signatures of individual volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and climate shifts with precision that makes human historical records seem brief and incomplete. The creatures that contributed to these sedimentary layers lived and died according to rhythms that connected the deepest ocean basins to changes occurring thousands of miles away on distant continents. Foraminifera, microscopic marine organisms that construct intricate shells from calcium carbonate dissolved in seawater. Record in the chemistry of their tests the exact temperature and salinity of the waters where they lived. When these tiny organisms died, their shells drifted down through miles of black water, settling onto abyssal plains where they accumulated alongside the skeletons of diatoms, radiolarians, and countless other marine microorganisms whose names are known only to specialists who study the ocean's smallest inhabitants. The precision of these natural archives surpasses anything achieved by human record-keeping systems. Isotope ratios preserved in fossilized shells reveal not just ancient temperatures, but also the volume of ice locked up in continental glaciers, the circulation patterns of ancient ocean currents, and even the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide during periods when no terrestrial life existed, to witness the slow transformation of Earth's climate system. These chemical signatures, readable only through sophisticated mass spectrometry techniques, provide data points for climate reconstructions that extend back hundreds of millions of years, revealing patterns of environmental change that operate on timescales utterly beyond human experience. The most remarkable aspect of deep-sea sedimentary preservation lies in its ability to capture instantaneous events within the context of gradual change. The asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period and eliminated non-avian dinosaurs appears in marine sediment cores as a thin layer of iridium-rich clay, marking the exact moment when vaporized extraterrestrial rock settled from atmospheric clouds onto seafloors around the world. Below this boundary layer lie sediments rich in the fossils of marine reptiles and diverse plankton communities that had flourished for millions of years. Above it, the fossil record shows dramatically reduced diversity and the beginning of evolutionary radiations that would eventually produce the mammals that colonized terrestrial environments vacated by extinct dinosaur lineages. Volcanic eruptions from throughout Earth's history leave their signatures in deep-sea sediments as layers of distinctive glass shards and mineral crystals that can be traced to specific eruption events through chemical fingerprinting techniques. The Toba supereruption, which occurred roughly 74,000 years ago in what is now Indonesia, deposited ash across the entire Indian Ocean basin, creating a marker horizon that appears in sediment cores from locations thousands of miles from the eruption site. These volcanic marker layers provide precise synchronization points for correlating environmental changes across different ocean basins, allowing scientists to reconstruct the global impacts of major eruptions on marine ecosystems and climate patterns. The deep ocean's preservation of organic materials creates archives that extend the sedimentary record beyond simple mineral deposition to include complex molecules that record biological processes occurring in ancient marine ecosystems. Biomarkers. Distinctive organic compounds produced by specific types of organisms persist in marine sediments for millions of years, providing direct evidence of ancient bacterial communities, algal blooms, and changes in marine productivity that responded to variations in ocean chemistry, temperature, and nutrient availability. These molecular fossils reveal ecosystem dynamics that operated long before complex life evolved. The hard shells and skeletons that dominate the visible fossil record. Perhaps the most profound discoveries emerging from deep-sea sediment studies involve evidence for rapid climate changes that occurred naturally throughout Earth's history, demonstrating that the planet's environmental systems can shift between radically different states much more quickly than previously imagined. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which occurred roughly 56 million years ago, saw global temperatures rise by 8 degrees Celsius within a few thousand years, a rate of change comparable to current anthropogenic warming, but driven by natural processes that released massive amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere through mechanisms that remain incompletely understood. The chemical records preserved in deep-sea sediments reveal that ancient climate changes often occurred in cascading phases that amplified initial triggers through feedback mechanisms operating across multiple Earth systems. Rising temperatures melted frozen methane deposits on continental margins, releasing additional greenhouse gases that accelerated warming. Changes in ocean circulation patterns altered the distribution of nutrients and heat around the globe, creating new patterns of marine productivity and atmospheric circulation that persisted for millions of years. These ancient examples of rapid environmental change provide crucial insights into how Earth's climate system might respond to contemporary human activities that are altering atmospheric chemistry at rates that exceed anything preserved in the geological record. Modern techniques for analyzing deep-sea sediments continue to reveal new details about ancient environments and the processes that shape them. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy can detect trace elements in sediment samples at concentrations measured in parts per million, revealing subtle changes in continental weathering patterns, volcanic activity, and marine chemistry that reflect broader environmental transformations. High-resolution microscopy allows paleontologists to identify and count individual microfossils in samples representing single seasons or years, creating records of ancient marine ecosystems with temporal resolution approaching that of modern ecological monitoring programs. The integration of deep-sea sedimentary data with records from ice cores, tree rings, and other paleoclimatic archives is producing increasingly sophisticated models of how Earth's environmental systems respond to various types of forcing mechanisms. These models suggest that the planet's climate system exhibits preferred states separated by thresholds that, once crossed, can trigger rapid transitions to alternative configurations that persist for millions of years. Understanding these thresholds and the mechanisms that control transitions between climate states has become crucial for predicting how ongoing human activities might alter Earth's environmental trajectory. The deep ocean's sedimentary archives preserve not just records of environmental change, but also evidence of life's remarkable ability to adapt to changing conditions through evolutionary processes that operate across vast timescales. Mass extinction events appear in the sedimentary record as sharp decreases in fossil diversity, followed by gradual recovery periods during which surviving lineages diversified to fill ecological niches vacated by extinct species. These evolutionary rebounds, recorded in the changing composition of microfossil assemblages, demonstrate life's resilience in the face of environmental catastrophes, while also revealing the long time scales required for ecosystems to recover their full complexity after major disruptions. In the perpetual darkness of abyssal trenches, where the weight of overlying water creates pressures that would instantly crush any surface-dwelling organism, the sedimentary record continues its patient accumulation. Each grain that settles onto the seafloor carries with it information about the world above the chemistry of surface waters warmed by sunlight. The productivity of marine ecosystems responding to seasonal changes, the atmospheric circulation patterns that transport dust and volcanic ash across continents and oceans. This information, compressed into layers of mud that will persist for millions of years, represents humanity's deepest archive, a library written in the language of chemistry and preserved in the most stable repositories that Earth provides for the storage of information across geological time. In the deepest places of the world's oceans, where the seafloor descends into trenches so profound that Mount Everest could be submerged with room to spare, darkness reigns with an absoluteness that has persisted since the formation of the ocean basins themselves. Here, in the Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Deep, and the abyssal plains that stretch between continents, water pressures approach the limits that molecular bonds can withstand, creating an environment so extreme that it seems to exist at the very edge of what Earth considers habitable. Yet even in these most remote corners of the planet, life persists with a patience that mirrors the geological processes that carve these depths from the sea floor. The creatures that inhabit these deepest waters have evolved forms so alien that they seem to belong to other worlds entirely. Transparent fish with antifreeze proteins in their blood drift through waters barely above freezing. Their bodies adapted to pressures that would liquefy surface-dwelling organisms instantly. Bacterial communities cluster around hydrothermal vents, deriving energy not from sunlight but from chemical reactions involving sulfur compounds that seep from Earth's interior through cracks in the oceanic crust. These organisms represent some of the most ancient forms of life on Earth, virtually unchanged since the earliest epochs when the planet's atmosphere contained no free oxygen and life existed only in the protective depths of primordial seas. The silence in these depths transcends any quiet that surface-dwelling creatures can imagine. No waves disturb the water column at depths of 7 miles below the surface. No storms, no tides, no seasonal changes penetrate to these abyssal realms where the temperature has remained constant for millions of years, and the only illumination comes from the bioluminescent displays of creatures that manufacture their own light through chemical processes perfected across hundreds of millions of years of evolution. In this eternal darkness, time moves according to rhythms measured not in days and seasons, but in the slow circulation of deep ocean currents that require centuries to complete their global circuits. The sediments that carpet these deepest basins accumulate so slowly that individual grains may rest on the seafloor for millennia before burial by subsequent deposition. The red clay that covers much of the abyssal Pacific forms at rates measured in millimeters per 1,000 years, creating geological records of such temporal resolution that they can preserve evidence of individual meteorite impacts, volcanic eruptions, and climate fluctuations that occurred tens of millions of years ago. These sediments, undisturbed by the biological activity that churns shallower seafloor deposits, preserve chemical and physical evidence of Earth's environmental history with a fidelity that approaches perfection. Within these sedimentary archives lie answers to questions that humanity has only begun to formulate. The deep ocean preserves records of atmospheric composition, global temperature, and biological productivity that extend back through multiple ice ages, mass extinction events, and episodes of rapid climate change that dwarf anything in recorded human history. Each sediment core extracted from these depths contains thousands of layers, each representing decades or centuries of environmental conditions, creating timelines that place human civilization within the context of planetary processes operating across scales that make individual human lifespans seem like momentary fluctuations in systems governed by geological patience. The pressure in these depths approaches 100 times greater than atmospheric pressure at sea level, creating physical conditions so extreme that water itself behaves differently than at the surface. The increased density affects sound transmission, chemical reactions, and even the fundamental properties of biological molecules. Yet, life has not merely survived in these conditions, but has evolved specialized adaptations that allow organisms to thrive under pressures that would be instantly lethal to surface life. These deep-sea communities represent alternative solutions to the basic challenges of existence. Evolutionary experiments that have been running in isolation for hundreds of millions of years. The trenches themselves result from tectonic processes that operate on timescales measured in tens of millions of years, as oceanic plates slowly subduct beneath continental margins or collide with other oceanic plates to form the deepest scars on Earth's surface. The Mariana Trench, deepest of all ocean features, continues to deepen by millimeters per year as the Pacific Plate slides beneath the Philippine Plate in a process that began during the Jurassic period when dinosaurs roamed continents positioned differently than their current locations. This ongoing collision will continue for millions of years into the future, creating depths that may eventually exceed anything that currently exists on Earth. The water that fills these trenches has traveled pathways that span the globe, beginning as precipitation over distant continents, flowing through river systems that may no longer exist, and joining deep ocean currents that transport it through all the world's ocean basins before it finally sinks to the deepest levels where it may remain for centuries before beginning its slow return toward the surface. This water carries dissolved minerals, gases, and organic compounds that record its history, creating chemical signatures that allow oceanographers to trace the circulation patterns that connect the deepest ocean trenches to surface waters thousands of miles away. In the perpetual winter of the deep ocean, where no seasonal changes penetrate and no daily rhythms of light and darkness provide temporal reference points, existence operates according to principles that seem to suspend ordinary concepts of time and change. The communities of organisms that inhabit these depths experience environmental conditions so stable that evolutionary change proceeds at rates barely detectable across human timescales. Some deep-sea species appear virtually identical to fossils hundreds of millions of years old, suggesting that the deep ocean serves as a refuge where ancient forms of life persist long after their shallow water relatives have evolved into entirely different organisms or vanished entirely from the fossil record. The exploration of these deepest waters requires technologies that push the limits of human engineering capabilities. Submersibles designed to reach the bottom of oceanic trenches must withstand pressures equivalent to having the weight of 50 jumbo jets pressing on every square meter of their surface area. The few humans who have descended to these depths describe an alien world where the fundamental assumptions of surface life, the presence of light, the availability of oxygen, the familiar behavior of matter under normal pressure simply do not apply. These brief visits to Earth's deepest places reveal environments as foreign as anything that might be discovered on distant planets, yet existing within our own world, separated from human civilization not by the vastness of space, but by the crushing weight of water that has accumulated over billions of years of planetary evolution. The mysteries preserved in the deepest ocean basins extend beyond scientific questions to philosophical puzzles about the nature of existence on a planet where most of the biosphere remains as unexplored as the surface of Mars. The deep sea may harbor forms of life that operate according to biochemical principles unlike anything found in surface environments. Organisms that derive energy from chemical processes that predate photosynthesis. Communities that exist in complete independence from the solar energy that powers all familiar ecosystems. These possibilities suggest that Earth itself may be far stranger and more diverse than human science has yet discovered, with entire branches of the tree of life existing in permanent darkness, following evolutionary pathways that diverged from surface life so long ago that they represent alternative experiments in what it means to be alive on this planet. In the silence that surrounds all questions, in the darkness that predates all answers, in the pressure that reduces all complexity to its essential elements, the deepest places of Earth's oceans continue their patient existence. Here, where the planet's most ancient secrets rest in sediments that have accumulated grain by grain across geological ages that span the entire history of complex life. The mysteries of Atlantis and all other lost civilizations dissolve into the larger mystery of a planet that has been losing and rediscovering itself for billions of years, always changing, always preserving, always keeping perfect records of impermanent worlds in the permanent darkness of the deepest waters, where time moves with the patience of stone and the silence holds all stories in perfect suspension, waiting. In this deepest silence, where all searching settles into stillness, the questions that brought us here begin to fade like the last light disappearing into oceanic depths. Did Atlantis exist? The answer rests now in the patient accumulation of understanding, not in the discovery of a single lost city, but in the recognition that countless civilizations have risen from the sea and returned to it, leaving traces so subtle that only the most careful observers can read the stories written in salt and sediment. The Mediterranean remembers everything. In its deepest basins, where pressure creates a silence more complete than any human meditation can achieve. Layers of mud preserve the chemical signatures of every society that ever looked across these waters toward horizons that promised new worlds. Minoan frescoes sleep in volcanic ash. Roman concrete cures beneath gentle currents. Byzantine gold rests in the holds of ships that will never reach their intended ports, their cargoes slowly becoming part of the seafloor itself. The rising seas that drowned Doggerland and filled the Black Sea basin continue their patient work, claiming coastlines millimeter by millimeter, year by year, with the same inexorable persistence that carved the Grand Canyon and raised the Himalayas. Human memory preserves fragments of these transformations in flood myths and cultural traditions. But the ocean itself maintains the complete record, written in languages that require no translation because they speak directly in the chemistry of water, the pressure of depth, the temperature of currents that have been circulating since before any eyes evolved to see their movement. Perhaps Atlantis exists wherever human consciousness meets the reality of geological time, not as a place that can be mapped or excavated, but as the recognition that all civilizations are temporary arrangements of matter and energy, islands of complexity that emerge from chaos and return to it with the regularity of tides. Every coastal city is Atlantis, waiting for its turn to contribute its atoms to the sedimentary archives that accumulate in the deep places where no light penetrates and no seasons mark the passage of time, in the trenches where the sea floor descends beyond the reach of sunlight, beyond the influence of weather, beyond the cycles that govern surface life. The planet keeps its deepest accounts in the currency of compressed time. Here, in the most stable repositories Earth provides, the stories of all lost worlds rest in layers so fine that they record not just the rise and fall of species and civilizations, but individual seasons, single storms, moments when atmospheric chemistry shifted in response to forces operating on scales that dwarf human comprehension. The darkness that surrounds these archives is not empty, but full of dissolved minerals that once formed mountains, full of organic molecules that once pulsed with life, full of information preserved with a fidelity that no human library can match. In this fullness, in this patient preservation of everything that has ever settled into the deep places, lies a peace that transcends any individual story of loss or discovery. The ocean remembers, and in remembering, releases all temporary forms back into the eternal circulation that connects every drop of water to every other, every grain of sediment to the mountains from which it weathered, every moment of existence to the vast stillness from which it emerged and to which it inevitably returns. Sleep comes to the deep ocean trenches not as the cessation of activity, but as the continuation of processes so slow and patient that they appear motionless from any human perspective. The bacteria that cluster around thermal vents continue their ancient chemical conversations. The sediments continue their grain-by-grain accumulation. The deep currents continue their centuries-long circuits, carrying dissolved stories from every corner of the planet to deposit them in the places where they will rest until continents shift and oceans drain and new seas form from the patient recycling of water and stone and time itself. In this deepest rest, all questions find their answers in the simple fact of continuation, not the continuation of any particular form or story, but the continuation of the processes that create and preserve and transform all forms and stories according to laws older than memory, patient as the movement of tectonic plates, gentle as the fall of individual grains, through miles of dark water to their final rest in the archives that will outlast every civilization yet to come. The silence deepens. The pressure equalizes. The temperature stabilizes at the point where all molecular motion slows to the rhythm of geological time. And in this rhythm, this deepest breathing of the planet itself, all stories dissolve into the perfect preservation of dreamless sleep.